Boa tarde, bem-vindos. Nós vamos dar início, então, à nossa palestra, dando poder à comunidade através do Projeto Democrático de Cidade. É uma palestra que antecede ao workshop, que inicia amanhã. E agradeço, então, a presença de todos, em nome da empresa Edutiri, da qual eu sou representante, em parceria com a Adriana Garcia, que também vai fazer a sua apresentação, apresentar os nossos convidados e dar prosseguimento, então, ao nosso evento. Nós temos à disposição, para quem quiser fazer uso, equipamento de tradução simultânea. Essa palestra está sendo transmitida e vai ser gravada, também disponibilizada a todos os participantes e demais interessados que não tiveram oportunidade de estar presente hoje aqui. A gente vai disponibilizar esse material a todos. Uma boa apresentação, uma boa palestra.
Boa tarde. Para aqueles que não me conhecem, eu sou Adriana Schinofen Garcia, professora na Escola de Arquitetura do Miami-Dade College de Miami, e uma das idealizadoras, né, dessa palestra, de trazer o AIA para cá. E eu gostaria, então, chamar para a mesa a Maria Cristina Dias Lei, da Faculdade de Arquitetura, diretora da Faculdade de Arquitetura da URGS, está aqui presente. Agradecer pela cedência do espaço. Agradecer ao Ministério Público do Estado do Rio Grande do Sul, que está nos dando a sala na Praça da Matriz para a realização do workshop. Gostaria de convidar o arquiteto e urbanista Edner Rodrigues Flores, vice-presidente do Instituto dos Arquitetos do Brasil, Departamento do Rio Grande do Sul, para fazer parte da mesa. Gostaria de convidar o Mr. Wayne Faden, urbanista, diretor de planejamento e sustentabilidade de Northampton, em Massachusetts, é professor adjunto e participa de vários times de processo comunitário do American Institute of Architects. Gostaria de chamar o Mr. Joel Mills, diretor do American Institute of Architects Center for Communities by Design, em Washington, 8 anos diretor do centro. Nos últimos 5 anos, catalisou em torno de 2 bilhões de dólares em projetos comunitários. Realiza de 8 a 10 processos democráticos de cidade ao ano. Atua nos Estados Unidos, Canadá, Reino Unido e Alemanha. Também realizou alguns projetos na Rússia. Gostaria também de comunicar que nós estamos aqui contando com a presença do senhor Patrick Levy, do Serviço de Desenvolvimento de Negócios, do Serviço Comercial dos Estados Unidos, parte do Consulado Geral Americano no Rio de Janeiro. Ele está participando como observador desse evento e a possibilidade de expandir para outras cidades brasileiras. Novamente, esse evento é uma realização da Edutiri, pela direção da Patrícia Moreira Moura, e por mim. Eu gostaria só de dar um breve histórico de como nós trouxemos o AIA e por que Porto Alegre. A ideia surgiu durante a audiência pública da Orla do Guaíba, em outubro de 2013, que ocorreu na Câmara dos Vereadores de Porto Alegre. Naquele evento, vi que a população de Porto Alegre, representada através de diversas associações e indivíduos, estava muito consciente da sua exclusão na definição programática da Orla, assim como as entidades profissionais, né, especialmente o IAB, declararam francamente contrárias à contratação de serviços arquitetônicos e de urbanismo por notório saber. E eu pensei, o que eu posso fazer? O que posso contribuir? Como eu conhecia o Mr. Joel Mills desde 2010, onde participei como cidadã do processo democrático para a revitalização do Rio Miami, contatei-o e as conversas iniciaram-se. Eu tive uma receptividade muito grande do AIA E após 2 anos de intensa troca de ideias e planejamento, hoje realizamos um sonho, que é trazê-los até aqui. E por que Porto Alegre? Além de eu ter crescido aqui, essa cidade tem uma tradição democrática e um histórico de pioneirismo nas questões de participação comunitária nas decisões da cidade. Espero que apreciem a palestra e comunico que as inscrições para o workshop estão abertas, que será amanhã e quinta-feira, bastando falar comigo ou com a Patrícia. Muito obrigada. Então, chamo o Mr. Joel Mills para iniciar a palestra. Comunico que a diretora da Faculdade de Arquitetura não poderá ficar todo o processo, mas, novamente, agradecemos o apoio.
I'm going to call my colleague Wayne Fiden up to co-present this lecture with me. Thank you to our distinguished hosts and organizers for this event. We're very happy to be in Porto Alegre. We got to town yesterday and have had a chance to walk around some of your beautiful city and got a bit of a tour by car earlier today, and have found it to be a wonderful place so far. So we're looking forward to the workshop over the next 2 days, not only to talk about the process that we'll introduce to you this afternoon, but to learn more about your city and some of the issues that you're working on. What we're going to share with you today is a bit of a perspective and a bit about a process that the AIA has had now for almost 50 years, mainly carried out in the United States, but as Adriana mentioned, it's been adapted, not adopted, but adapted to fit other contexts in Canada, in the UK, in Germany, and used in places like Russia and Lebanon, other places across the world. So it's a process that really works to involve people in decisions about the built environment. And I always like to start with a quote from Jane Jacobs, and I'll read it so it can be translated. It says, "Cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody." It's sort of a famous quote that's almost 50 years old in the United States, but speaks to the values of the process that we utilize in communities across the country today. And the basic point is that there are no better experts about a city than its citizens that experience it every day. You know, citizens know more about the character and the experience of a city and contribute to it each day in their activities. It's really a democratic idea. You know, just a little bit of larger context here. You know, we are all moving towards an urban future, whether we live in Brazil or other places. There are a few statistics here, you know, but the basic one is 60% of us are going to live in cities in the next few decades, and you know, there are currently over 1 billion people who are living in what we would call squatter settlements or slums. So housing is a huge issue, and we have the challenges of climate change, equity, equality, you know, all of those things on top of this big issue. And then we have what we call global warming, not the one that we think of with climate change, but the other global warming, the fact that this sign says, "I am very upset." This one says, "Nobody listens." And this is a representation of just some, I could have filled the slide with pictures from all over the world, but some of the protests that are occurring across the world today as civil society demands more of a voice in processes, whether that's about the future of their city or about something else. A few examples, this is Hong Kong today, the umbrella revolution that's taking place there as citizens demand more democratic processes. This is from just a couple of years ago in New York City in the US, part of the Occupy movement in Zuccotti Park. I grabbed this off the web, but this is one from Brazil in recent years. And right now, across the United States, we have protests in a lot of our major cities resulting from, most specifically, a couple of murders that occurred in a police incidents, but they're really speaking to larger questions about equality and urban living and race. And in our country, our citizens are so upset right now that Darth Vader, a fictional evil character from the movie Star Wars, currently polls higher than any of our major potential presidential candidates in the next race, which speaks to sort of, what the overall mood is in the country. This sign says, "Mother, should I trust the government?" And in our country, just 13% of Americans, when polled, say that it's something that I would do all the time, and 10% say never. So it's really about how people perceive of and think about government in a large, big picture sense, and then how do we interact? How are we citizens if things are going this way?
And I think I'd add that it's not just citizens who are happy with what government's doing. I work for a city, and for cities, if we fail to engage our citizens, we lose their political support. So it's really hard to move forward in any project if we don't move forward and engage our communities. So a lot of work in the United States, in Brazil, around the world, is really focused on how can we change our processes so we can keep our citizens involved with it. So you can't read this if you don't speak English, but this is just sort of a list of the traditional techniques that governments use: public hearings, public meetings, surveys, a whole host of techniques that are often mandated by law, sometimes not, and are often very ineffective. And so we're all sort of searching for what are the new ways to bring people together. So we know our community members are polarized. We know there's a lot of disagreements, whether it's they like Darth Vader more than they like our mayor. But how do we try to re-knit cities together so we can get successes in these projects? And so this quote, again for translation: civilizations rise and fall, and sometimes, if they're lucky, they renew themselves. So we know the change is continuous. We know that what we're talking about today and the next couple of days for a workshop, we never reach the end game. We know that we keep needing new changes. So part of what we want to talk about is what are the techniques, what are the ways that we can engage community members, and also, maybe more importantly, what's the mindset for our communities, for you all as architects, for city government, for national governments, to just always think about the continuous change process so that citizens can be engaged. And so, what are the processes? How do we move from conflict? I gave a lecture years ago in Hungary in an audience that didn't speak English, and I started talking about not in my backyard. And through most of the lecture, people had no idea what I was saying until my translator spoke. And as soon as I said, "not in my backyard," they all smiled. It was apparently, the same term is used in Europe as well. And so how do we change that mindset? What are the ways we get people involved to work with us? And so finally, my point is that cities, at least the better cities, the more progressive cities, are as engaged in this movement as communities are, and how do we get them to move forward and to be our partners.
And the other point here is that the pace of change and innovation is moving at such a speed that it's very difficult for government, especially, to keep up with it. We have, we work through law and regulation in government, and as an individual outside of government, we can work with speed and innovation in ways that government just can't keep up. This is a book by Hernando Soto from Peru that was very popular 25 years ago, describing what they call the informal economy in Peru. Citizens innovating to come up with ways to form cabs, get get business accomplished in ways that was kind of undermining in some ways what the regulatory framework was, but making sure that they were successful as a community. And the other item is a magazine cover about what we call now the sharing economy, which is Uber and Lyft and Airbnb and these other online applications that are allowing citizens to conduct business and collaborate in ways that we don't have a legal framework to cover. And it just emphasizes the point that innovation is moving at such speed now. It's both a challenge when it comes to law, but it's also a real opportunity, particularly when you think about government and citizens working together on things. A couple of just brief points. These are U.S. examples of poll numbers on what the public's expectations are now. And most of the citizens in the U.S. now expect to be personally involved. That's the exact words, personally involved in community planning efforts, because they feel like they're more invested in their community than anyone else should be. This slide speaks to an internationally accepted spectrum of public participation that starts on this left-hand side with lower levels of participation, informing the public, consulting the public, and then moves into higher levels, involving the public, collaborating directly with the public, or at the very end of it, empowering the public. They're all valid ways to work with the public, but obviously, once you get to this side of the spectrum, you're talking about more intense levels of public participation. And in most places in the world today, this is what we're comfortable with as government and organization, the inform and consult level. And the public really wants the other side of the spectrum. The middle, where we're talking about involvement, is the sweet spot for us in many places. Citizens don't necessarily want to make the ultimate decisions, but they want to be meaningfully involved so that their involvement in the process influences the decision that's ultimately made. And governments are responding to this. These images are from a jurisdiction, one of our oldest in the U.S., called Hampton, Virginia, that the city leaders there were in a crisis because all of their quality of life indicators were declining. And they got to a point where they said, well, we're willing to try new things. Let's involve the youth directly in that process. And so they created a youth initiative, formed a youth commission. Then they began bringing youth onto every other city commission they had. They created youth planner programs, so there were youth working with the city planners hand in hand, and all of their quality of life indicators started going up as a result. Just one example. This is another example from Tampa, Florida, where they're trying to engage young professionals that are in their 20s and 30s that are often tough to get involved in the regular city process through new events. This one's called Urbanism on Tap, and involves more of a social atmosphere, getting together for a happy hour, but then talking about city issues as a part of it. And this is an example from Auckland, New Zealand, on their waterfront, where they've asked, what would make it easier to hook a fish here? And you can use a UPC symbol with your phone and pull up a comment form and actually submit your comments online to help inform their government with what their future of their waterfront should look like. A couple more examples that just kind of illustrate that we can do this in high-tech and low-tech ways. These are stickers on abandoned buildings that simply say, "I wish this was," and allow you to fill in whatever it is. And these signs on the left are speaking to an app that's a part of the sharing economy. It's called IOB, or In Our Backyard. So it's sort of a response to not in our backyard, what we don't want to see. They've taken vacant sites and said, well, what do we want to see? And then created a crowdfunding application so citizens can actually begin funding, in this case, a farmer's market on a specific site. So the sort of big picture is that the challenge is that the scale of the issues we're facing today are super complex and interrelated, but the upside is the transferability of our ideas, how ideas can be utilized and adapted from one place to another is getting a lot easier for us. We're using a lot of the same technologies. We kind of speak the same language, at least in terms of design and other things. And then finally, civil society has never been as strong as it is today. The public sector is in many places weaker than it's ever been and has less resources, but civil society has more resources and more capabilities, so it's an opportunity to partner and create cities together. One fun example that I'm very proud of about how global contributions can come from everywhere. This is Brazilian Nene, who plays in our National Basketball Association for my team, the Washington Wizards. And we are currently, I think we're going to win the conference this year. And it just is a very personal representation of how we're contributing in the same ways no matter where we are. A little bit different, this is a vacant building from New Orleans in the United States after their big storm. Artist Candy Chang started this project that just says, before I die, and then it leaves you blanks to fill it in, and it became such a popular thing that it is now in over 60 countries in just a few years, including here in Brazil. And it's these ideas can be transferred and adapted. Similar idea, Parking Day, which was started by a design firm in San Francisco in 2005. Where you simply take a day and take a parking spot and create a park for people and kind of emphasize moving from having a car-centered life to having public spaces that are vibrant and full of people. It started in 2005 and it's in over 162 cities, 35 countries now every year, including here in Brazil. And then maybe my favorite, maybe yours as well, this is what you started. This is the participatory budgeting project or process that was started here in Porto Alegre in 1989, and it is now all over the world. You can take a process and adapt it to other places. And in the U.S., we've only recently, in the last 3 years, we've brought participatory budgeting to the U.S., and people think it's the greatest new invention. They had never heard of it before. They didn't realize there was such history, and so the people doing it in the U.S. are getting all kinds of accolades as if they've, invented something. But a few people have pointed out, actually, no, this comes from Brazil. It's been around for a long time. They've been doing it very well. So, what can a community do outside of and with local government to revitalize and renew a city? There are a list of things. It includes being able to articulate a collective vision about what the community wants, being able to set the table for partnerships, whether that's with government, whether that's with investors, the development community, or others. Mobilizing volunteers. Huge army of people can get a lot done. And then leveraging resources beyond government to do things. And finally, it's all about building momentum as a community. Once you're able to build excitement and momentum, it becomes something everyone wants to be involved in, whether you're an investor or a citizen or a city staff person or someone else. Here are a few project level examples. This comes from Seattle, Washington, where they took a vacant block. They had a program there called the Neighborhood Matching Fund, where government would put up 50% of the funds. The neighborhood had to have a neighborhood planning process, and they had to come up with the idea for the project they wanted, and they had to supply the volunteers and 50% of the funds, and then government would match it with 50%. So in this neighborhood, they had a vacant block, and they had a visioning process and said, well, what would we love to have there? Ice cream stores, bookstores, things like that, and they hired an artist to create a mural. And it created so much excitement. People are slowing down in their cars to see what's going on. And an investor came in and said, okay, I'm going to develop that block. And he put in some of the things that they wanted. An example of mobilizing volunteers, this is from New Zealand in Christchurch, where they had a horrific earthquake a few years ago. They had sort of gaps between the buildings, so they started a project with volunteers to fill those gaps with public spaces, and they created what they called the Pallet Pavilion with just volunteers. These are all warehouse pallets that they took to create the space, and it instantly became, you know, a place where you had performances, a place where the community gathered, a nightlife spot, and really began to transform that place. This example comes from Houston, Texas, where they have a lot of vacant housing, dilapidated housing, and some artists got together and took one of the homes and just recycled it as an amphitheater, and this instantly became the center of that neighborhood with all the activity. You guys seem to do well with paint here. I've seen a lot of great street art and other things, but this is an example from Seattle, again from their neighborhood program, demonstrating just what you can do with paint to create a different street. And then, you know, getting into transforming different places. This is a terrible underpass that they somehow got through all the red tape of government to create an off-road bike course that became a centerpiece of that neighborhood. And this is maybe my favorite. This is the first project they did in Seattle, and it's what they call the neighborhood is called Fremont, and this is the Fremont Troll. And just to get an idea of the scale of this, that is an actual Volkswagen automobile in the troll's hand. So it's just a crazy artistic idea, and the neighborhood really wanted it. And the city staff person that had come up with the neighborhood matching fund idea said, "We can't do this. You know, I'm going to get run out of town. We can't do this." And they said, "This is what we want." And so the city did approve it, and they created this. And now it is the place to be. They like to dress it up. You know, here's wearing shades. Holiday season comes, he gets the Santa hat, you know, all kinds of public events take place, and, you know, we're in an underpass that you would never otherwise be at, and it's become the center of that community. I was out there with a film crew this summer doing a story on it, and the tour bus traffic is ridiculous now because all the tourists have to go see it. So it's created an economic impact for that community. And then they're now selling troll porter beer, and I don't even know what to call this decorative troll themed item, but you know, another crazy idea. This is an artist that is from Europe who travels around with his giant 2 or 3 story rubber duck that he parks in city waterfronts for a fee. He's making a killing. And it was in Pittsburgh last year. And, you know, you think this is ridiculous. How much did this cost the city? You know, but, and what's this worth? You know, but over 100,000 people came out to see just the installment of this crazy, silly duck. And over 1 month that the duck was there, they were able to generate $10 million in economic impact. So the duck, you know, was worth $10 million to that city. And so sometimes it's thinking, you know, just about fun things that are joyful, that create an exciting place to be. You know, this example comes from Philadelphia, and it's it's called the Independence Beer Garden, but they took a derelict, it was a commercial building that had a plaza that was, no one would go there. It was just terrible. And they programmed it with, these are shipping containers. They're an industrial city, they have an industrial waterfront, and they turned the shipping containers into bars. And I went there this summer, and there was a rope line. They had to close off the area and have a waiting line to get in. They had over 1,000 people going to a place that no one ever used to visit. They also did this on their industrial waterfront. This is called Spruce Street Harbor Park in Philadelphia, where they brought barges into the waterfront between industrial places. And they got 20,000 people to show up just on the opening weekend for this site, and they only do it in the summer. It's not a permanent site. It cost them very little to pull this off. They just programmed it with lots of chairs, lots of lights, you know, fun things to do, bars and games and things like that. And it brings, you know, tons and tons of people out. You can kind of see this as part of the beer garden area of the site. But they also have LED lights that they've hung in all the trees. So at night, it's the place to be there in the summer. and they had hammocks strung between all the trees. And I went there. I couldn't find a hammock. I was having to search for a hammock because it was so packed with people. They also do this in the winter. So this is a project called Winterfest, which it gets very cold there in the winter. And again, they took their industrial waterfront, which is, you can see the before picture. It was an old parking lot. And these are the after pictures. They created a skating rink. They have fireworks out there. They've got a fire pit in the open air. You've got shopping and retail. You've got a lodge where you can go in and have food and drink, that kind of thing. And it's going again this year because it created so much excitement. It took a spot that no one in the community would ever visit and made it a destination point that everyone wants to go to, so they have to bring it back every year. Another example from New Zealand this time, this is their annual Christmas, this is again temporary, but this is their Christmas celebration, Santa's Bach they call it, and they've taken an industrial site. You can see they're right on the water. That's a boat in the background there, and then they're showing movies on the silos. They've got lots of tents set up again, and so you've created a destination out of a place that was not something someone wanted to spend time at previously. This is an example from Toronto, and this is a permanent project where they took a parking deck on their industrial waterfront and created Sugar Beach, where they've just brought sand to the waterfront, created a beach atmosphere, and then for whatever reason they chose these pink umbrellas, which made it a sensation there. So it snows there in the winter. They leave the umbrellas up because it becomes a pretty thing to see. And people travel from all over, and you can see the surrounding context is still industrial activity that's happening, but people love to go to this park. And the bottom line on these things, this is Millennium Park in Chicago, which was very controversial when it was built on an old rail yard, but in 10 years, the bottom line is it generated almost $1.5 billion in economic output by having a great public space. This is the High Line in New York City, and we were walking around your city earlier today and saw you have one elevated abandoned stretch of rail. So could you imagine if that became a park, that kind of thing. That's what they did here. They had an abandoned stretch. The city was going to tear this down because they weren't going to use it as a rail service anymore. And a citizen group actually stepped up and said, no, we want this to be a park. And they began fundraising, and then the city said, oh, this is actually going to be worth it. And so the city joined the effort, and they developed this linear park that runs all the way through a good portion of Manhattan. And I think it's been open 3 years now. It's already generated over $2 billion in new investment as people want to have, they want to have hotels and apartment buildings and all kinds of activity around, what's a great public space that's drawing people in from everywhere. This is maybe my favorite part of it. They've actually set up kind of like an amphitheater where you actually look down on the street activity in New York City, which is something people love to do, is watch all the activity in that city. So now we get to our sort of piece of the process. How do we move from projects to a community process that's generating momentum so that you can catalyze greater and greater investment? And this is the AIA's, what we call the Design Assistance Program. And these are some of the locations we've been in since the late 1960s. It was a response to our civil rights movement and the demand that citizens' voices be a part of the process and the future of cities there. And what has happened over time is to receive lots of international awards. We've been modeled by our military, has used it now for base planning. Universities have modeled it and created community processes. City planning departments have created processes based on it. Most of our architectural firms now have a process that is related to it. And then in Canada, they've adapted it, as well as the UK. A little bit of history on it. It started in the US, but it has a strong South African influence based on this gentleman right here named David Lewis. This is Prince Charles next to him. But David was from South Africa, born in South Africa, He helped start the National Student Union and was an anti-apartheid voice as a student, and as a result was exiled. He went to the UK to study architecture, and then he came to the US, and he was part of our early program and really instilled it with a lot of the democratic values that carried on. He also, instead of naming the firm after the founders, they called it Urban Design Associates. And the idea behind it is that every citizen is a designer. Everyone in a city is a designer, and you're co-designing the future of that city. This shot is actually from 1989 when Prince Charles came to the United States, and we had a team that was made up of both Americans and Brits that did a project in Pittsburgh there, and then they modeled the process and took it back. It has a few sort of overriding principles. The first is that community design is interdisciplinary. So we always have an architect on the team, but we also have planners on the team, economic development specialists, transportation specialists, whatever that community needs. It's a response to the issues in the community, so it's customized, not something that we don't do it the same way every time. It's different every time. Each team that we have it's a national team. They're neutral outsiders because they're doing this as a public service. They don't earn a cent for their participation in the project. They're not from that city, they come from somewhere else, and they're not developing any business as a result of it. And so they're in that community to listen to what the public says about what they're working on, to observe what the conditions are on the ground, and then to offer their best professional expertise in the public interest. There's not a client, they don't work for the city, they work for the whole community. And then finally, because they're outsiders, they don't know a lot. They sometimes, like Wayne and I today, it's the first time we've ever been in your community. I couldn't tell you, what you should do. You should be telling me what the key things are. And so in every project, it's a lot of heavy emphasis on community participation, public workshops, the citizen voice to drive then what the team recommends ultimately. So a few things that we're not, most cities are used to hiring a consultant firm, and there are issues that come with that in terms of perception because citizens often see the consultants having an agenda or they're getting paid too much. It's not producing a planning document either. Every community I work in, the conversation normally starts with, please don't produce another plan for us. We have lots of plans already. They all sit on the shelves. We need help implementing strategies. And so what we produce at the end of the day is a report with specific recommendations of actions that they should take as a whole community. So it will include government, it might include the business sector, might include schools or others, but it's holistic. And so, it's public service in the public interest, and it's very action-oriented and community-focused. And this is kind of, this is just representative images from one particular project. It's a lot about drawing, ideas for potential sites or places or streets, etc. And this is a typical community meeting that's happening. It's a very interactive process. We don't have community sessions that are all run the same way, so we'll often work with maps. This is Wayne working in a town in Pennsylvania with a corridor that was about 10 miles, or I guess that's about almost 15 kilometers long, and working with citizens to identify sort of what were the key places on that corridor to focus, what are some of the key issues. And it's about meaningful involvement, getting as many people from a community involved in the conversation at the same time, both so that they understand what the conversation and what their other citizens and others think about it, and to begin building partnerships. We often say that the process is much more powerful than the expertise that the team brings to it, because all of the sort of partnerships that happen as a result normally come out of conversations in some of these meetings. We also try to make it an exciting civic activity, and so this is some photos from Newport, Vermont, small town where we had a high school design competition as a part of the process, and then gave an award to some of the top designs. But it gave parents an opportunity to hear from the youth in that community about the future of the the community they were working in. Another example from California, this one was interesting because in the particular town, the adults were against having a lot of tall buildings, but when they asked their 6- and 8-year-old kids what the future of the city looked like, they all started drawing these tall buildings, which made the adults say, oh, well, maybe we're not thinking about the future the way we should. We also always work with university students when there's a university present, both to give them the exposure to a national team and a community process, but also because it allows us to develop a lot of additional graphics and a lot of other things for what becomes a final report. We try to have each community brand their process, so these are just different logos from different communities we've worked in that relate specifically to their local identity rather than a national process. And then we try to make each one of them culturally relevant, so we ask each community for their ideas about what are important things to them locally. And in this case, as a small town in Texas, they had a competition over historic doors for their homes and created a poster, and there was a competition with an award for whoever could identify all the addresses, and it created more excitement than anything else they did. So when we got to town, it was a town of just 7,000. It was smaller than most neighborhoods in urban environments, but they had over 700 people that greeted the team when we arrived in town. And they had the oldest, this is a German-style band, but this is Texas, and this is the history of it there. So they're the oldest one in the state. Their street banners say Oompa, which is sort of the polka band rhythm. And so they had the band play at the opening. In a totally different context, this is northern Vermont. They have a tradition called Sugar on Snow, which is the initial social gathering of the season when there's a cold winter there. Winter ends and they have the first tap of trees that make maple syrup. And so they pour the maple syrup on fresh snow and eat it as sort of a delightful little dessert. But it's also a social event where the community first gets together after the winter. And so that's when we had our kickoff there. And again, hundreds of people turned out. This is a California example where they just did street stencils all over the place, advertising the process with the website and other things. Another example about place where there was a community that had a memorial that was very important, and so we had the meetings at the memorial site, which a lot of citizens hadn't even visited. It was about homesteading, which is the middle of our country. There was a homestead program to encourage population growth, and they're now declining in population, so one of the recommendations was to restart the homesteading idea. So this is a New York Times article about what came out of the process there. We use food a lot of communities, the communal experience of food works, and this was an example from Portland, Maine, where they had a neighborhood that it's a gateway site for refugees that come from all over the world, and so they speak 160 different languages. Many of them they were refugees, so they came from countries where speaking out in a public forum was something that the last thing that you wanted to do. And so the idea here was to have a potluck dinner, an international potluck dinner, and it was phenomenally successful, and I don't think I've ever eaten that much because they had these giant tables and all these matrons of the family that brought their national dish that they're very proud of. So even when my plate got full, they said, "No, you're having mine," and so ate a lot, but it also made sure that the event was intergenerational because the kids were there. In a lot of the cases, the kids were translating for their parents, so it became a great community event for them. Whenever we're in Texas, I added the Texas slide because I know barbecue is big in Brazil. Whenever we're in Texas, barbecue is involved in that process somehow because it's a social event for people there. And so in the communities we work in, one of the things that I always hear is, where else have you worked? Okay, I understand it's worked in those places, but that doesn't mean it's going to work here. We're different than other places. We have some unique circumstances, and I don't know how it's going to work here. And all of that is true. Every community is unique. And each community has this unique history, but they tend to face some common obstacles, which I've listed here. We find a lot of communities are facing nostalgia about we used to have a port, We used to have, whatever it is. We used to be, our identity used to be something else. And so struggling with a vision for what a future identity would be. They face inertia, well, let's keep studying that idea instead of let's start building actions that create momentum for our community. Often there's conflict, everything is controversial, so it's tough to get people working together because we're too busy fighting over things. And then there's institutional sclerosis, some of the earlier slides that we spoke of where there's a process for doing things that's a little too slow. And so it's about sort of breaking through that and getting the whole community involved. This is an image of sort of how we see a lot of communities trying to work, where they're all focused on one big project, this big investment, this new convention center, or this new downtown development that it's going to require billions of dollars, and they think that's going to change everything for the positive, and so they focus on that, and it may take a decade to get to that project, and in the meantime, there's no visual progress. There's just been talk about something that people think might or might not happen, and so often what happens is you get 5 years into it, and the whole thing falls apart, and nothing happens. So in the successful communities that we work in, this is the opposite effect, what we call the snowball effect, where it's about what can we do tomorrow with no money and volunteers, and then leverage for the next thing that just requires a little bit, and it creates more momentum and more and more and more. And then, at the end of the day, they actually end up getting the big projects that they always wanted because they've created momentum with little things. It's all about momentum. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Wayne to talk in specific about one small community, and then I think I'll finish with another one.
Great. So, as Joel said, we've done these projects all over the United States. I've personally been involved with, I think, 34 of these projects, and I do this as a volunteer because they're really rewarding. You see a huge change in a community. I've been involved with projects as large as a couple in New York City and as small as, tiny little villages. So the methods the communities are unique, but the basic methods are fairly similar. Joel talked about four important lessons for these things. One is the collaboration, community with the city. The second is about the shared vision. The third is focusing on momentum, and the fourth is just making it fun. And that builds momentum as well. And so Port Angeles sort of had all those things. Very small community, port community. They used to be a natural resource community, log trees and made them into wood. And those industries sort of had collapsed. And so the downtown wasn't very successful. But they did believe in collaboration. And you could go to Port Angeles any day of the week and have breakfast with some group who is dedicated to making Port Angeles better. And every day of the week you could have a different breakfast and you could talk about more things, and not a lot happened. So they had this initial collaboration of people wanting to do something, but they didn't really have that momentum. They couldn't figure out how to move forward for doing it. So our job was to help them provide that vision, help them break this log jam, and figure out how to move forward. So we did this process. We had a lot of community meetings. We met with all those people who met for breakfast every day. We met with as many citizens. And with them, we sort of came up with a shared vision. We reflected back in large part what they said. They had a lot of really good ideas. We brought in perspectives from around the country in different disciplines, and then gave them a laundry list of things that could go forward. And what we're really trying to give them is a vision that would survive any project. So we talked about, what your community might look like in 20 years, and then we gave them a long shopping list of things to do. And what they did literally the day we left is they took our report, they took what they heard from both us and other citizens, and they made a checklist. That's what this is. And they just circulated the checklist, and they said, there's 100 items, whatever are on the list. What should we do tomorrow? Let's also talk about what to do 5 years from now and 10 years from now, but what we should do tomorrow immediately. And one of the things that so we gave them this long list of things, and they went through and said, okay, we're going to do a bunch of things. We're going to make changes to our regulations, but we know that's not going to take place for a long time. We're going to make some public investments, but we know people won't see that immediately. And so they decided they want to do something to really get immediate changes. And so the first thing they started thinking about is, what kind of community are they? How do we make it fun? What are the shared things? So this is Sasquatch on a bicycle. That's sort of the vision. This is a mythical creature in the Pacific Northwest. This is sort of idea of what kind of community do they want to be. But then the immediate thing is they knew they had a bridge which was going to be closed for a while, and so access to town was going to be limited. And they said, how do we take advantage of this downtime when we're going to lose a lot of business? And what they said, following up on some of our recommendations, is they need to clean up the facades. In this particular community, each community is different. One of the challenges they had is downtown just looked really tired. The buildings just were worn out. They weren't that attractive. They had a ferry in town that brought 1.5 million people a year through the ferry. So they had a lot of people driving through their downtown to get to the ferry and not stopping. If you were going on the ferry, you'd drive through town and you would not get out of your car or out of your bus. You'd say, unexciting town, how do we keep going? And so their first piece was just fixing up the buildings, repainting some of the buildings, with the idea being if you get people to stay in town for 1, 2, 3 hours, 1.5 million people a year, that starts generating money and it starts building on itself. And so after we were there, they immediately did this effort, totally volunteer driven. They had most of the paint donated. They had all the labor donated. They had some materials in terms of scissor lifts and other things they had to rent, but very low cost, and really transformed what the community looked like. So we came back, I think, a year after we were there the first time, and it was as if we were in a different town. And so it was, they had the energy up front, they had this community effort, how could you harness that energy? Because one of the worst things is community groups can't do anything without a municipality. They can organize, but it's hard to get things done. Municipalities can't do anything without community groups. And so how do you build that synergy of getting them to work together in the effort? So, the first thing they did was facade improvements, then they focused on other things. So they did some streetscape improvements. Last slide was before they add bike paths or bike lanes. The second one was with bike lanes, really calming traffic. This is a town that's an industrial town. Logging trucks move through, so it was sort of scary to cross the streets. So calming the traffic was one of the first things that they thought was really important, sort of to retake what kind of town it was. And then they did wayfinding signage. Again, they wanted to send a message because they were trying to grab tourists in town. They wanted to make it easier for people to navigate. And so, wayfinding isn't required in most communities, but for the communities where you get lost, where you're trying to create a sense of place and identity, wayfinding can be incredibly important. And their wayfinding was both sort of traditional wayfinding signs, but also art in the streets to sort of make things a little more lively and get people more involved in the process. And so out of that process, they've had lots more steps. So many of the longer term steps have started going forward. The most important, basically changing the waterfront. They are a waterfront community. That's the most important feature they have that makes them unique, and yet you can't really get to the waterfront in most of their downtown. It's not dissimilar to your port, where you have this amazing access to the waterfront, and you can't get that from downtown. You get it, from the power plant south, but not going through downtown. So that was sort of a similar thing, and those became the longer-term investments that they did, bring in millions of dollars afterwards in new investments, both public sector investments in the waterfront, and that's what this is, and then private sector investments right behind the waterfront. So there's the waterfront, and if you look to the left, you start seeing a lot more activity going on, getting people in, people walking along the waterfront, people enjoying life, people not getting on the ferry and staying a little bit longer, enjoying the views, and then with more people in town, more private sector investment. So this is what this building looked like when we were there. This is what the building looked like today. It's becoming a small town. This has become an anchor for downtown because suddenly this vibrancy, suddenly can support a little more life and people spending more money. And then just different scenes. You see our Sasquatch on the bike again, but different scenes of sort of life, people coming back downtown. They didn't have much downtown living. That's just sort of beginning of getting people coming there. But generally, sort of how do you get all those vibrancies going forward?
And I'm going to wrap up because I do want to get a couple of questions in if we can. And I know we're down to the last little bit. I do want to just show you what happens over time because we just showed you 2 projects that occurred within 5 years, or one project that occurred within 5 years. And over time, it continues to build momentum. So this is Portland, Oregon, where we were. This is 1983, derelict warehouse district, and we had a process there. And so it builds momentum over time. Today, we told them, keep the buildings, don't tear these down. They were going to tear these down and redevelop. And we said, these have great character, you can build a special place. So today it's called the Pearl District, and it's celebrated as one of the great urban renaissance stories in the United States. And this one comes from San Francisco just a year later, 1984. They had this elevated highway on their waterfront. We said you should tear that down and build an urban design plan for that area. And today it's an iconic place in America that everyone wants to visit. I'm actually going to go there over the holidays myself because I like to visit it. So, this gives you a taste of, we'll go into much more detail at the workshop tomorrow and Thursday, but this gives you a taste of what the process is. And the question that I haven't translated at the bottom is what does this mean to you? Obviously, this is Porto Alegre. And so that's what we're going to delve into over the next 2 days. But if we still have a smidgen of time, I'd love to take at least a question or two if we can. Okay. Any questions?
Nós temos uns papéis que foram distribuídos. Quem já elaborou a pergunta, por favor, alcance para uma das... Enquanto isso, queres fazer uma pergunta?
Alô? Boa tarde a todos. Não seria exatamente uma pergunta, mas acho que vale a pena o registro.
Alô? Tá. Bom, em nome do Instituto dos Arquitetos do Brasil, agradecer a organização do evento, aqui em especial a Adriana, que eu acho que teve um desempenho muito grande. Agradecer a presença do Sr. Mills, do Sr. Feiren, e eu não sabia que tinha mais um outro convidado que está discretamente aqui atrás. Agradecer a presença. Dizer que o Instituto dos Arquitetos tem alguns projetos, entre eles em médio prazo, que é a realização do nosso Congresso Internacional de Arquitetura, que vai acontecer no Rio de Janeiro em 2020, e a curto prazo, tentar atender algumas questões pontuais da nossa cidade e do nosso estado e, quiçá, dos nossos outros departamentos a nível nacional. Isso passa por todo um processo de reavaliação dos pontos que nós entendemos ser importantes da cidade que nós queremos, né? E Porto Alegre, esse logo, ele nos leva a querer reafirmar alguns conceitos, inclusive de estruturação das cidades, né, e da nossa cidade, e de avaliação do grande protótipo que foi, do grande evento que foi o orçamento participativo. Hoje ele requer uma reavaliação, requer um estudo aprofundado, requer uma discussão maior, obedecendo vários itens que o Dr. Mills colocou, pontuais e locais, né, atendendo questões nossas, e isso tem que ser reavaliado. Mas é um pontapé, é um início que foi deflagrado e que nós temos que avaliar com muito cuidado. Tendo essa visão, o Instituto entendeu da necessidade de apoiar, né, e divulgar e tentar abrir essa porta, que eu acho que ela é importante, de comunicação, e fica aqui um registro de que nós possamos fazer isso com maior ênfase. Evidentemente que atendendo, né, as questões das nossas cidades. Quando falamos nossas cidades, seria em Porto Alegre, mas evidentemente que estende-se isso ao Brasil e à América do Sul e, quiçá, ao mundo, né? Então, a presença dos senhores é importante. Nós temos muito que avaliar
e boas ideias, ideias que venham do exterior e ideias que nasçam aqui, para que em conjunto possamos fazer isso acontecer. Então, em nome do Instituto dos Arquitetos, agradeço a presença, quero desejar um sucesso no workshop amanhã, que nós, infelizmente, não vou poder participar, gostaria muito, mas reforço aqui a necessidade de que possamos construir, né, uma ponte, não um viaduto, mas uma ponte que possamos juntos trilhar, né, e chegarmos a alcançar alguns sucessos. Essa construção é longa, né, vai desde o equipamento imobiliário urbano mais singelo que se possa ter para a nossa cidade, até a reorganização do nosso cais do porto, por exemplo, que tanto precisa. Sem que esqueçamos um único detalhe, que a comunidade, e reforçando o que os senhores estão colocando, é papel importante. Isso requer uma reavaliação política, inclusive, né, do que é o poder público a nível mundial, né, e possamos daí ter os resultados. Agradeço a presença e saibam que se o churrasco do Texas é bom, vocês ainda não provaram o churrasco do gaúcho no Brasil. Obrigado, um abraço.
Nós já temos uma pergunta aqui encaminhada, né? Quiseres que a autora da pergunta, Cláudia, da linha, também faça alguma manifestação, senão pode ficar à vontade para responder.
So there were two questions. The first was, I have to take this off. The first was, how do you see your work when compared to other groups such as, I think it's the Project for Public Spaces, yes, and others acting in the U.S. and abroad. It's a growing activity in the United States, and there are a lot of organizations that have either modeled what we're doing or doing something similar. And most of it, I'm based in Washington, D.C., so not PPS, but other organizations such as the American Planning Association and others that are now doing this. We actually meet once a month just to share information and learn from each other's projects. But if I were to distinguish us, we're all a little bit different. And I think that the grassroots nature of our process has been different than others. And that's why we've had a lot more catalytic results from communities over time, because people are involved on the front end of the process, and a lot of people are involved. We do a process and you can get over 1,000 people, and it creates tremendous energy. And a lot of the other organizations, I just did something with PPS in the Northeast recently, and they're doing great work too, but they work a little bit differently, where it's working with a public space and working with stakeholders, but not necessarily a full-scale community process. So I think that's how I distinguish us. Your second question is really important. She said, do we realize that the workshop that we're offering is very expensive, and so only some people can afford it. And this is, for us, is a first offering. We had, it's my first time in your country, and I've had lots of help putting it together. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to. And so we're not charging any fee associated with it. We were just trying to cover the costs of organizing it. But we've received that feedback that it's pretty expensive. So as things move forward into the future, we want to find a way to lower the cost so that more people can get access to it. Because our interest at the end of the day is as many people as we can share this with. That's the more people that can begin to work on developing or adapting something that might work here. And that's our ultimate goal. I don't want to make any money from it. I just want to share the experience and learn from you as we do it. So. Right, and she said that because the cost is high, it necessarily then limits who is represented in the room when we have the workshop. So that's a limiting factor for us, and I definitely do realize that, and we'll work on that as we develop anything into the future for sure.
Quanto aos custos, né, nós tentamos cortar o máximo possível. Com o dólar alto, nós tivemos custos mais elevados. E o AIA foi o único patrocinador do evento. Ele está cobrindo metade dos custos, eles fizeram o possível, e as inscrições cobrariam os outros, mas não há nenhum lucro na operação. E os palestrantes vêm sem ganhar nada, né? Então, tentou-se o possível, e esse é o primeiro, a gente sabe. O outro ponto é que o mesmo curso oferecido nos Estados Unidos de 1 dia e meio, e não 2 dias, por uma instituição similar, é o dobro do valor. Que é uma instituição que faz só isso, né, para fins lucrativos. Mas a gente está levando em consideração, e a nossa ideia é de levar para outras cidades também, e obter mais patrocínio. Então, se a senhora estiver na nossa lista de e-mails, vai receber os próximos eventos. Obrigada.
Boa tarde. Parabenizo ao palestrante realmente, Adriana, pelo convite. Muito obrigado, realmente foi excelente a apresentação de vocês. Simplesmente eu quero remarcar algumas questões que vocês fizeram em sua dissertação, né? Estou totalmente de acordo que as fases elevadas dos processos participativos realmente são quando existem processos colaborativos e de empoderamento da sociedade. O sea, no simplemente basta participar si no existe colaboración. Son procesos primarios los procesos de participación. En ese caso puedo decir, por ejemplo, Porto Alegre con su proyecto de orçamento participativo, ainda en fase inicial. Cuando ustedes entran en una fase de colaboración digital y de empoderamiento social de cada una de esas participaciones, de cada uno de los actores sociales, es que realmente se inicia un proceso de transformación de la sociedad. En ese sentido, yo pregunto por los señores, ¿cuál es la experiencia específica de los señores dentro de estos procesos colaborativos en los Estados Unidos o en otras ciudades y sobre todo focado en la área de movilidad? Segunda questão associada à primeira. Pode haver um processo colaborativo ser efetivo quando a administração pública, o poder público, não está querendo iniciar este processo de transformação, não está querendo fazer esse problema?
I'll answer your second question first. We have specific cases where the mayor of a municipality didn't want to have us engaged with the community. And so there's one project that maybe it speaks a little bit to both of your questions, but it was an inner city neighborhood in Indianapolis, in our middle of our country. And the neighborhood had been industrial in its history and had gone through all of the impacts of that. So you had a historic African-American neighborhood that had 6 what we call brownfields, so they're environmentally contaminated sites, lots of vacant housing. They've been neglected by local government for decades, and they were angry at government. And so when there was a local university that invited us to come to town for that project, and I had to do a special meeting with the community members a couple of weeks beforehand, because they don't trust local government at all. They don't participate in it. Local government's done nothing for them, and they said, "Who are you?" And once we explained, hey, we have a team that's, they're not from the community, they're not being paid a cent, they're not working for the city, they're here to listen to the community and come up with ideas based on what we hear from you. Then they all said, let me tell you, and so the community became engaged with the idea of, we're going to come up with something that benefits our community regardless of what local government does. But what was interesting was what happened with local government, because the mayor, he sent a couple of city staff people to be involved, but he didn't want any involvement in this. And the university did a good job with media. So our team showed up, we had a bus for the neighborhood tour, where residents were leading us around and showing us various things. And all of the cameras, we were on the morning news, we were on the midday news, we were there on the evening news, and we had hundreds of people come out. And then we had a federal official that came to one of our town hall sessions with the public and said, more or less, we pledge our support to help with this. And it just generated so much momentum that finally the mayor's staff were telling him, you have to get over there. You can't ignore this anymore because you're going to feel the consequences if you do. So he showed up on the last day spontaneously and sort of met with people that were there and tried to make it, his own initiative. But it totally changed him at the end of the day, and he as a result of the process, changed his position on policies to favor the neighborhood and do some taxing districts that were going to bring them additional resources to revitalize the neighborhood. So it totally impacted him. We've had other towns where the mayors got ousted afterwards and they weren't very supportive either going in, but once you get a huge community process behind, you don't see the mayor acting on it, and everyone's been involved in that conversation, and everyone says, well, we just need a new mayor. And so that's happened as well with projects. With the Indianapolis example, one of the things that was an issue for them is they're in a neighborhood that's 2 miles from their downtown where most of the jobs are, and you had very spotty transit service and things like that. And so mobility is a big issue for the residents of that neighborhood because they need to access jobs, they need to access amenities. There weren't really amenities in their neighborhood anymore. It had been, it had totally changed over the years and gone from something very vibrant to something that was mostly empty. So some of the big things that came out of that were immediately additional transit lines. We had university students that worked with a neighborhood resident on a new bus stop design during our process was 4 days long there. And during the process, this is just one of the side conversations that took place. And so the students came up with a design for a bus stop, and she took it to the owner of the site. He owned the property, and he agreed during the 4-day process, okay, we can have a bus stop there, and I like the design too. And then, in a couple of months, they had a new bus stop as a result of the process for that specific site, but they extended the transit lines, and they're planning a light rail that's going to serve that neighborhood as well. It'll go all the way out to suburbs. So, that's sort of the power of the process in a specific context. We've had similar projects in other places where issues were, lack of markets, there were what we call food deserts. There's no place to buy groceries anywhere in a neighborhood, and then you have a public process, and one of the big things that gets identified is, hey, there's not even, look at all the people here. And we'll normally have an expert in economic analysis, then he'll or she'll stand up and be able to say, actually, you have the market to support a grocery store, and so this is something that someone should be looking at. And in those cases, many times, there's been some grocery store that says, hey, we're going to open, they'll immediately invest because for them it's an investment opportunity. And so having the conversation opens the door to those things.
Just generally, these processes tend to be very successful when there's a lot of community engagement, whether the municipality was involved in the first place or not, and they tend not to be very successful. There's not community engagement. So the most important thing we always tell our partners is you really have to beat the bushes and get not only a lot of people, but diverse stakeholders from all the different interests in town.
Boa tarde a todos. O material que nós assistimos, demonstra que todo esse incentivo à população de participar da formação da cidade, ela gera na sua essência espaços públicos, seja melhorando ou constituindo novos espaços públicos. A nossa cultura aqui no Brasil, ela não é muito regrada, digamos assim, em relação à geração do espaço público. Os nossos planos diretores no país, eles focam essencialmente a área privada e não tanto a área pública. Quando a gente fala em área pública no Brasil, espaços públicos, nós imaginamos praças e parques. Nós não enxergamos calçadas, por exemplo, como fazendo parte dessa rede de espaços públicos. Então, assim, o entendimento que o espaço público, o limite dele, como ele é constituído, eu acredito que seja um empecilho para o cidadão participar, né, sair mais às ruas e participar e exigir do poder público uma atenção maior. Por exemplo, nós não temos a cultura no Brasil de ter um plano diretor de espaços públicos. Isso não existe no nosso país. O governo investe no nosso país nas ruas, nas estradas, mas ele não investe nas calçadas. Quem faz o espaço público calçada no Brasil é o cidadão. E nós sabemos que é uma das raras exceções do mundo, né? Então, assim, o que essas cidades têm de diferente em relação à nossa situação cultural, no momento em que, provavelmente, esses outros governos, essas outras culturas e realidades, o governo já faz a criação desse espaço público e, com isso, acredito eu, facilita o acesso dessas pessoas a propor mudanças maiores, integrando a cidade, a parte privada com a parte pública, no que eu vejo na nossa cultura ser uma dificuldade.
Thank you. And I should clarify, and this is, we'll go into much more detail during the workshop, but I didn't in the lecture because we had to present a lot of material quickly, but we do, the scope of our projects, I showed a lot of public spaces in the photos, but we tackle all kinds of issues. So something that might relate to a lot of the conversation here recently is just in August, we were in Corpus Christi, Texas, so a port city where they're actually getting ready to move a bridge that goes over their port and realign it further upriver. And as a result, where the bridge used to be and the highway used to be, there's going to be empty space in the middle of the neighborhood. And what do they do with that? And so we came up with a whole urban design and development plan about future development for that neighborhood, that's based on the opportunity that comes with moving the bridge. But we also focus a lot on transportation, and just having been here a day, one of the things that when I immediately started thinking about here when we travel around in a car is your transportation networks. And that's something that we often focus on, and we, especially when we do projects in major cities or in downtowns, is, what are these recommendations always go to government at the end of the day. It's the same in the United States. Government is responsible for the road network, the public infrastructure. Citizens can't do anything about that other than, ask for things that they want. But a lot of the recommendations, government will often respond to. In the city in Texas, they've already responded to some of the ones that I thought would have been pushing them a little bit far, because they see the efficiency that comes from making changes to their original designs, and they know that they're going to get a better road network as a result of what was suggested by the team. And some of that still comes out of this, it comes out of listening to what the citizen experience is, or the local business experience is with using the network. And so in their case, it was, they have a lot of port traffic that's bottlenecked in a neighborhood where you don't want them to be. How can you alleviate that and create something that's efficient, that moves goods and services, doesn't cost them as much money, but also creates a vibrant neighborhood. So I think that the process can be adapted to it's totally a different culture here than it is in the United States. Than it is, I was just in Dublin, Ireland 2 weeks ago to talk about our process there. And they're going through something completely different, where they had a big real estate boom, like a lot of people, and then it totally fell off in 2008, and now they want to deal with some of the poor projects that happen. So they had some buildings, particularly apartment buildings, that were built that aren't safe in some cases. They're poorly designed. So now they want to go back and see, how do we create neighborhoods that work, even though we've got some buildings that don't. And their mindset about urban living is completely different. No one wants to live in an urban setting in Dublin. They all want to live out in the country and drive cars. And the folks that are buying apartments there are mostly immigrants that are coming from city settings where they're more comfortable with an urban lifestyle. So it's a totally different mindset there. And in their case, they have to be able to articulate the benefits of an urban lifestyle, i.e. not having to sit in a car, for 2 hours to get to your job if you live downtown, and having all the amenities that surround where you live. But totally different cultural setting, but the process still works, because at the end of the day, it's about getting citizens together to articulate aspirations and needs and desires about whatever it may be. Maybe the quality of the buildings, could be the urban spaces, it could be the economy and jobs, all those things. And the process can be adapted to look at any of those things.
Just quick, it depends on the project, but typically doing real visualizations is part of the process as well. So creating drawings so people can really visualize what they're doing, and that brings citizens together more than just words on paper could.
Boa tarde, muito obrigado. Meu nome é Gonçalo. Eu gostaria de colocar o seguinte: nós já falamos das comunidades, falamos do poder público. Eu gostaria de saber algumas linhas gerais do que acontece quando o poder econômico da cidade não concorda com os projetos das comunidades e o poder público duvida escutar a comunidade ou o poder econômico.
Give one example of a project we were involved with in Tampa, Florida. And I'm not, the city does some really good things, but the city was not a leader in the process. It was a local neighborhood group or a group of architects and designers who came together, who asked for AIA to do this process. And so in that case, because it was this community group and not the city, a lot of the successes that came out of the project weren't necessarily bricks and mortar on the ground. They were things like, the parking day that Joel mentioned. Or specific street events where they were really working to change the culture of Tampa. So it's much slower. I mean, we just did a follow-up 6 years after the fact a couple months ago, and they've made incredible changes in the community. Some are bricks and mortar projects that the city's doing, but some are just this group of designers out there working with community members and getting more and more support for those ideas. And so the less government's involved in the process, the more challenged you are. Maybe the outcome is often more public education and public engagement, frankly, to change the politics in the community.
And I would just say we definitely have worked in communities where there's a major employer or industry that we're not changing anything we do, we're here to make money. And I think it does take a little bit more time, but when you start working on some of the pieces that you can do without that entity being involved, it creates more and more pressure and momentum. A lot of times they will reverse their position as some things get started, or they'll open the door to more conversations, at least once they see other things happening, regardless of them. But it is more of a long-term prospect because they own their property. A lot of those large employers, they own a lot of property, and until you can either come up with an incentive for them or give them something in the process that benefits something they want to do, it's tough initially until they see something else happening.
Última pergunta, mais alguém?
Tá bom. Boa tarde, meu nome é Samuel Quintana. A pergunta é o planejamento tático que estamos tratando e que está estabelecido na realidade, constituem uma forma de inversão do urbanismo tradicional, com uma enorme gama de demandas pontuais, multifacetárias, e com a qual os arquitetos muitas vezes não estão acostumados a lidar. Uma dinâmica que inverte a pirâmide do poder. A pergunta é quem vai pensar o todo e qual o papel do urbanista nesse processo?
That's a very good question. It is a challenge for some, just to see even the culture in the United States now. It's an expectation by the public, and you are inverting sort of where a lot, especially designers that love to go design by themselves. This is a whole new world to them, and they have to change. Because they're finding more and more that when they go design something on their own, it's rejected. No one wants to have a project that's rejected, or that's heavily criticized. Everyone wants to be celebrated. And now today, in order to be celebrated, it really involves listening to a community at the front end and having that drive the design so it reflects that community. If you go off and design it yourself, we have what we call the U.S. architects that, create all kinds of glittering structures, but they have had mixed success in terms of how they're received. And in some places, they're roundly criticized because they didn't ever talk to the public before that project went up. And in their case, they have the benefit of a wealthy benefactor that paid for the project. But in most cases, whoever is investing in that project is counting on public support so that it can be built at the end of the day. And so it requires them it's a new kind of design for some. For others, they've been doing it for a long time, and it's sort of ingrained in how they work. But I agree, it's a little bit different. The other piece that's different is working more interdisciplinary as a team, because that's the way that citizens like to plan. Citizens don't want to go and discuss a transportation plan on Monday and an economic plan on Tuesday. They want to sit down and talk about how they all connect, and that's the way that it should be talked about. And so that requires a change from professionals to think about those things. And that's one of the reasons why all of our teams are volunteer. And so I pick up the phone and I'll call anybody. I like to work with the best, and so I'll call the best on whatever the topic is. And I never get turned down because they don't want to do it. Occasionally there's a scheduling conflict, but no one turns me down because they're not interested in it, because it's such a rich professional environment when it's an interdisciplinary team and you haven't met the other team members and they all come from a different background, and we're working in a new community that most folks haven't visited. It's a really rich professional experience.
I got to add, too, that it's not that we're upending everything. I mean, the majority of decisions are still going to be made in the same process they are now. We're just sort of trying to add a stronger collaborative effort to that piece. So the overall equation, it's not like everything changes. It's just that we're sort of saying we expect the paradigm to shift a little bit. In the United States, at least, many of the communities that were most engaged in collaborative planning are the ones that survived the recession the most, because they created spaces that serve for multiple uses. So one kind of business collapses and somebody else comes in. So many communities are sort of buying into it just as an economic development strategy.
Bem, nós vamos ter que encerrar, porque o auditório vai ser ocupado às 16h30. Eu gostaria de agradecer aos palestrantes pela disposição de vir até aqui, de preparar a palestra. Agradecer a todos por terem vindo, que a grande razão do nosso trabalho é a presença de vocês. Gostaríamos de convidá-los para um happy hour por adesão na Casa de Cultura Mário Quintana, no 7º andar. Os palestrantes vão estar lá, então vocês terão mais oportunidade para conversar com eles. Comunicar que as nossas assistentes têm a ficha de inscrição, se você quiser ainda fazer a inscrição. E agradecer ao IAB pela filmagem, né? Vai estar disponível no site do IAB, se vocês quiserem divulgar e que outras pessoas vejam e discutir. E, enfim, algum outro anúncio? Não? Então tá, muito obrigada. E vamos nos ver no próximo workshop. Provavelmente será em Florianópolis.